I'm happy. It's a little bit interesting with Zoom, but if you guys have any questions, again, feel free to message Jamal and interrupt along the way, and we can make this a little bit dynamic if that's more interesting. But like you said, I'm working at the Seattle Kraken, which is the new NHL franchise in Seattle. We start playing games next year in the 2021-22 season. So we have a whole season that will happen at some point. That's undecided due to COVID, but once that season happens, we'll be entering the league the year afterwards. I've been there just over 10 months now, so coming up on a year, and it's been a really exciting time. This research I'm presenting to you guys is research I did during my master's. So because I'm in hockey, I can still talk about basketball. So we don't really have foul trouble in hockey, and so this is research I did with my master's supervisor, Tim Schwartz, at Simon Fraser University. So that's that. The talk is titled, "It's Fun Getting into Foul Trouble." I'm not going to try playing this video. Oh, it's no longer on YouTube. What the hell? It used to be on YouTube. It's the reason for the title of the talk is there was an advertisement for the board game Trouble, and I had the theme song going through my head every time I worked on this project. And so that's where the name comes from, but I guess the video is not there anymore. A little about me. So again, like I said, I was at Simon Fraser University, and before that, or during that time, I worked at the NBA in their basketball strategy and analytics department. I also competed with 3 of my really good friends in the NFL Big Data Bowl, which if you caught Jamal and I talking earlier, the newest version of the Big Data Bowl just got released. And that Big Data Bowl really put my friends and I on the map and got us interest from NHL, NBA, and NFL teams to go work for them. And so it's kind of crazy to think about, but I went from trying to be a math teacher at SFU to, being able to work for a professional sports team. So it's been kind of a crazy journey, but I'm super happy to be at the Kraken. They're an incredible organization, and yeah, we're gonna have a great season in 2 years or in a year. So I'm going to start off the talk with a motivating example about the 2018 NBA playoffs. So what I want to talk about is a first-round matchup between the Indiana Pacers and the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cleveland Cavaliers, I believe, were the 4 seed. Indiana was the 5 seed. And the Indiana Pacers had their star player, Victor Oladipo. Right? He was recently injured this most recent playoffs, but I grabbed a quote from the Indiana Post, I believe it was, about Victor Oladipo. And they say, how important is Oladipo to the Indiana Pacers? It's like asking how important Beyonce was to Destiny's Child, or how important LeBron James is to the Cleveland Cavaliers. Indy Star is the paper it came from. And so considering that we have such an important player, we can kind of look at his stats in this series. And so he was the leader of the Pacers in minutes per game, points per game, rebounds per game, assists per game. You get the idea. Steals and playing time per game. Okay. So minutes, he averaged 37 for the series. And in the first game, he played 37 minutes. In the second game, he played 28. And then in the next 4 or 5, he averaged about 40 minutes a game. Okay, so this really concerning thing happens here is like, why did he only play 28 minutes? And so for those of you that know basketball, you'll know the reason, and you'll know the purpose of this talk. But I've grabbed this quote from Nate McMillan, the head coach. It says, anytime you lose one of your best players, he can't help you on the bench, right? And so to me, if you read this quote without context about what foul trouble is, you think that like Victor Oladipo got hurt, or he got suspended, or something really bad. He did something really bad. But actually, he was just in foul trouble. So foul trouble, as defined by Google, is a situation in which a player is in danger of exceeding the number of permitted fouls and being put out of the game. And the most important thing to realize here is that when you exceed the number of fouls, you're put out of the game. But anything being put out of the game anytime before that is definitely the choice of the coach. And it's definitely a choice that you get to make. You don't have to try to save them from fouling out. And so in the NBA, just for those who don't know, you foul out when you have 6 fouls and can no longer play. The reason why foul trouble exists is because coaches want their best players available at the end of the game. Whether that's important or not is another question. Coaches use a Q+1 rule to determine when a player is in foul trouble, so that's quarter plus 1. So when a player has one more foul than the quarter, then they're considered to be in foul trouble. So you can imagine if you have 3 fouls in the second quarter, 4 fouls in the third quarter, 2 fouls in the first quarter, you're in foul trouble. And the coaches will often remove that player from the game to preserve them for the end of the game, especially if they're a star player. So we can do something here. We can look at Oladipo's rotations. So in most games, he would play kind of most of the first quarter, then he'd go to the bench. He'd sit until kind of just after the start of the second quarter. He'd get to play. He'd get a rest at halftime. He'd start the third quarter. He'd go to the bench, and then he'd finish off the last 10 minutes of the fourth. He played the last 2 minutes in 52 of the 75 regular season games that he played in. Right, so this is showing like how important he is to have in the game at the end. In the playoffs, it's a similar rotation, except all those rests get shrunk because he's more important. He played the last 2 minutes in 5 of the 7 games that he got to play in these playoffs. So in this particular game that we talked about, or that we're talking about, we have his playoff rotation up here for comparison, but he picks up his first foul, and then he picks up his second foul, and then he goes to the bench for what's 10 or 11 minutes in this first quarter, right? Which is a big departure from his usual rotation. During this time, his team was a -11, right? He comes back, he plays 7 minutes, he picks up his third foul midway through the second, and he sits again all this time that he normally doesn't sit. His team was a -2 during that time. Finally, he gets to play most of the third. He gets his regular rest, but for a little bit longer than usual. And then he plays the last bit of the fourth quarter. They end up losing by 2 points. And so the question is, if he had played in this -11 stretch, or even a little bit in this -2 stretch, right, that he normally plays during a regular playoff game where he's not in foul trouble, would the Indiana Pacers have survived? The other thing to know here, Victor Oladipo only picked up 3 fouls. He didn't pick up 4, 5, or 6. So after this part, he didn't have a chance of fouling out. If he had picked up a third kind of in this first quarter, would he have picked up his 4th here and then maybe played the rest of the game and been fine? There's a lot of hypotheticals here, but it's just to illustrate that minimizing the risk of fouling out in order to have them there at the end of the game might not be so smart if you go -11 or -13 across these stretches where he was sitting on the bench. And so this raises a bunch of questions. Most importantly, is Q+1 appropriate for all players? And so this has been looked at before. So Evans and Saney looked at NBA fouls and did a survival analysis, and they were looking at whether players were got angry and frustrated after fouls, and whether they had increased foul rates after a foul. Rockford looked at NBA foul calls and whether star players got better treatment. Klobuchar looked at kind of NBA foul substitution analysis, and Maimon and Shen looked at how players play during foul trouble. When they get played during foul trouble, do they play worse? Which is a really important aspect of this problem. And finally, Falk in 2018 wrote a blog post about this exact example and detailed less statistical things, but more just ideas and strategies to think about when you're thinking about foul trouble. Finally, Seth Partnow, who now writes for The Athletic and previously worked for the Milwaukee Bucks and wrote for Nylon Calculus and a bunch of other places, wrote again kind of his general thoughts about foul trouble and how most coaches mismanage foul trouble. So the data for this project was taken from Saney and Evans, who originally did their kind of foul analysis study, and Catherine Evans used to be a really big fan of the Warriors, and now she works for the Toronto Raptors. And so she loves DeMarcus Cousins like I love DeMarcus Cousins. So this is kind of an ode to her. But the last thing I'll point out before I start talking about the actual analysis is that all the code for this project is available on my GitHub. So if you guys are interested in any of the code that generates any of these plots or generates any of the results, it's all there, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it. So just to kind of recap all that preamble, our goals for this project are more effective estimation of foul trouble. And then we want a personal foul trouble strategy for each player. We want to account for differences in behavior at different foul levels, because when you get into foul trouble, players might treat you differently and you might play differently. And then we also want to use information from censored observations. So that's something that we didn't really talk about, but it's the idea that if we don't observe a foul, then that is still information that we have. If you play 20 minutes without fouling, that is still really important information for us to use. So what I propose using, or what we propose using, is a gamma distribution that models the fouling times of each player at each foul level. Okay, so you can see here, this is Kaplan-Meier curve is kind of like the raw data, and the gamma curve is a model that describes this kind of raw data. And this will allow us to flexibly increase our foul rate with respect to time. So the idea is that if you are more likely to foul as you play more, then this gamma distribution will be able to help model that. And that's something that we found throughout this research, is that as you play more, you're more likely to pick up a foul. I'm going to talk quickly about how we deal with censored data. So in regular kind of modeling, every time we observe a foul, the likelihood of that happening is the time, right, given the parameters of our gamma distribution. Each time that we have a censored likelihood, we know that the observation lasted at least, let's say, 20 minutes or at least 10 minutes, right? So it's 1 minus the likelihood that we'd get to that Y value, that time to foul, given the parameters of our distribution. And finally, for every single foul that the player has throughout their data set, we have the likelihoods are all of the observed fouls and then all of the censored fouls. So we multiply those all together, and if we minimize this expression, we can find the alpha and beta that best fit this likelihood. Okay. So if you're not kind of into all the modeling side of things, we can just get to the results, but this is kind of for full full context of how we're doing the modeling.
Danny, we have a quick question here.
Yeah.
In that model, what does the delta represent?
Right, the delta is whether the observation was censored or not. So for each, if you're censored, then delta is 1, in which case this is to the power of 0, which would be 1, and then this is to the power of 1, which would then leave you with this. So for each foul that occurs, you get either this one or that one, and then we multiply over, this product is multiplying over all fouls. So my notation is kind of sloppy here because I didn't want to like have six modeling slides. I just wanted to have one, and so the notation is kind of sloppy, but the delta is just indicating whether an observation is censored or not, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect, thank you.
Cool. So just to check in on those goals that I mentioned earlier, we don't know yet if we have a more effective estimation of foul trouble, but we definitely, what we're doing, because we're modeling this for each player at each foul level, or we have a personal foul trouble strategy for each player. We'll account for differences in behavior at different foul levels, and we're going to use information from censored observation. So we've hit 3 of the 4 goals, and now we're going to kind of go through the results to see whether we have a more effective estimation of foul trouble. So the last thing to watch out for is that we have a problem, and that's that we don't have that much data. So for players that don't foul often, they may not reach higher foul levels very often. So Victor Oladipo, somebody who barely ever got 3 fouls in a game, we don't really know how he behaves at 4 or 5, at foul levels 4 or 5, when he has 4 or 5 fouls. We don't really know how he behaves. So that leaves us less information to fit our parameters. And like I said, Oladipo is one of the players we're most interested in. Klay Thompson would be another one who doesn't foul a lot, but if they get into foul trouble, right, they're the most interesting cases. Because can we trust them to not foul when they have 3 or when they have 4? So what we do is we can borrow information from other players at other foul levels, right? And so what we do is we make a Bayesian model, and we can borrow information across foul levels and across players. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a prior, and we're going to let a player's parameters for that foul level come from a distribution of parameters that depends on their position and foul level. So we're going to say that players generally behave like other players at their position who have that similar number of fouls when we have less data. And to do this, we'll use a multivariate truncated normal distribution. And again, I'm going to kind of leave the modeling details aside there. But the last thing I'll say about fitting the model is that we use STAN. So we're going to generate distributions using MCMC for the parameters of the gamma distribution. And then the really fun thing we're going to be able to do is then do predictions of playing time to foul. And then even more importantly, predictions of playing time to foul out. So we're going to get distributions for each of those parameters. And so here we can see here like a distribution of our alpha parameter in the gamma distribution, a distribution of our beta parameter in our gamma distribution. And then we're going to get 1,000 samples of our predicted time to foul out and 1,000 samples of predicted playing time to foul out. So from each foul level, if this is with 3 fouls, this is a distribution, so it's a sum of your time to foul out at 3 fouls, at 4 fouls, at 5 fouls, at 6 fouls, and then we get 1 observation in this sample. So this is the type of output we get, and then we can kind of push this into more understandable kind of graphics and results. So the first thing is when Oladipo has 2 fouls, this is his survival curve. So we think that he will play the rest of the game, or play 36 minutes with 2 fouls over 50% of the time. He will play 48 minutes with 2 fouls. If he has 2 fouls, he'll play 48 more minutes with a kind of 30% chance, right? So what you can do here is if, let's say, at the start of the second quarter, he has 2 fouls, so there's 36 minutes left in the game, and let's budget, let's say, 30 minutes for him because he gets rest naturally throughout the game, then we think there's about just over a 70% chance of him playing those 30 minutes. That's a pretty good likelihood, and that's something that we could, if we work with a coach, we can say, okay, what is your risk tolerance? How important is it to have Oladipo available at the end of the game? And if he says there's a 90% chance, I need him there 90% of the time, well, then you'll have to come up here and say, hey, well, your budget's only, 18 to 20 minutes. But if he says, okay, I can handle 60% chance that he's there at the end of the game, now you're down here, now you have a budget of 34 minutes to work with. So we can really use this information to inform coaches with a budget of minutes to work with, and then they can allocate those minutes throughout the rest of the game. Instead of taking all of that rest up front, realizing that Oladipo is going to have rest throughout the game, and distribute that kind of evenly across his normal regular rotations. Okay. The other thing we can do here is this foul trouble cheat sheet. So this is condensing this one curve into this one curve into this one little box. That was with 2 fouls. All of that information is now encoded in these colors, and so now we can get 6 of those curves on one cheat sheet. So we do lose some precision when we're working with colors. It's kind of hard to match like which yellow this is, but we can kind of pick out 50% really easily. So when Oladipo has 2 fouls, there's about a 50% chance that he'll play 38 minutes. When he has 3 fouls, there's about 50% chance that he'll play 26 minutes, right? And so on and so forth. And we can create this for every player. Throughout kind of these NBA playoffs, I was kind of tweeting them out for players as they got into foul trouble. So I did some for Pascal Siakam. I did some for Bam Adebayo. I did some for Giannis. So for each player, we can get kind of these cheat sheets. And for some of them are very similar, but some of them are very, very different. So now we can kind of answer the question, was Victor Oladipo in foul trouble in game 2? And so if we were using his regular season rotations, at the point where he got picked up 2 more fouls, we say he has 34 minutes of playing time left to play, and we'd say that he survives that 58% of the time. So a decent chance. Using his playoff rotations, that falls down to 42%. All right, so that means from this point on, Oladipo was averaging 41 minutes. And if we wanted him to play that, that's 42%. So maybe that's a little bit of a risk for Nate McMillan. My idea would still be, like, if we can avoid needing him in the clutch, then that's an even better situation. But if you desperately think you need him there in the clutch, this 42% survival rate might be a little bit low. If we look at Q+1, which is the strategy they used, they gave him 28 minutes using their Q+1 strategy. It ensured them a 70% chance at survival. And finally, what I've done is made a 40% risk strategy. So this is kind of my suggested rotations for him. He picks up the second foul, get him quick 4 minutes of rest, get him back in the first, take him out just near the end of the second, let him use that quarter break to rest, get him into the second, and then it's pretty much his regular rotation from here on out. This gives us a 60% chance of survival, which I think is a good job of balancing more minutes, which is 33, over having him available, over a little bit additional risk to have him not available at the end. We can do the same thing when he has 3 fouls. So at this point, if we use his regular season rotations and just kept playing him regularly, he'd survive 53% of the time. If we use his playoff rotations, he'd survive 43% of the time. Using Q+1, he'd survive 62% of the time. And finally, using our kind of 40% risk strategy, he would survive 60% of the time with 21 minutes. So this one's not too different. I think Oladipo's curve is actually a little bit closer to Q+1 than I thought when I started this project. But there's something here that kind of a place for future work, which is it's not still super personalized for players who don't have a lot of data up at the higher foul levels. It kind of reverts them to their position and their behavior, whereas I think Oladipo is actually probably on the lower side in terms of risk of fouling than his relative to his position. So incorporating a little bit more of that information is something that we're planning to do in the near future. And so finally, I have this slide for coaches. And I have a quote from Daryl Morey that says, "Good teams don't win close games, they avoid them." And this is a really big point of, like, if we can maximize our minutes for our star players, I think, and I have ideas for how to model this further, I think that's more important and will give you a better chance to win than just like having them available in the clutch. Because if you win by 5, then you don't need them to take the last shot. Or if you win by 10, you probably don't need them in the last 2 minutes anyways. And so if they foul out with 3 minutes left or 4 minutes left, but you have a 12-point lead, I would take that trade over having being down 5 and having Victor Oladipo in the game, because chances are he's not going to get you back from 5. So that's a really good quote to keep in mind. The other things I have is just to understand your players' foul habits. I don't think coaches have thought super deeply about each player's foul habits. They treat Dwight Howard the same as they do Victor Oladipo or Klay Thompson or even LeBron James. Players get rest through rotations. That's something that is super important to keep in mind. And then there are things that you can do to lower a player's foul rate. These are kind of mean rates, but you can change defensive assignments and hide them and do stuff there. Finally, you need to determine the importance of end of game situations. And like I said, balancing out like that decision of more playing time for your players against end of game importance for your players. And I asked the question, how often is the game close enough at the end that you need your best player available? And how many times can we avoid that situation? We just play them more earlier. The last thing I hear is from Jamal. So this is a text I got after I presented some of this initial research. And he says, do you remember when you were coaching my grade 10 team and we were playing Cent and I picked up 2 fouls in the first 5 minutes or so and you benched me the whole first half? Should have had one of those nice paper sheets with you then. So, I mean, I wish I could have one of these sheets for Jamal Chu. I don't think we were collecting data back then. But when I was coaching his team back in grade 10, I was definitely not on a data-driven thought process and definitely on a Q+1 basketball coaches mindset. And I wish I had been thinking differently. But leave it to your younger brother to, like, 4 years later, call out your coaching mistakes in your second year of coaching. So with that, I'll finish up really quick with just future work. So defensive assignments, rest, perceived foul trouble, and then, like I said, I don't have it here, but kind of personalized foul trouble, personalized estimation kind of at higher foul levels for players who don't get to those levels as often. And then I think this is the really important one that I want to really dig down and have some ideas in getting into, are which parts of the game are most valuable, and when is control of playing time more important than the amount of playing time? And that's really the crux of the question. This first foul trouble, survival probability model will feed into, combine with this model to create, like, you could then do an optimization problem that says, okay, play them these exact minutes. If you have a good estimation of when each player is the most valuable, and you have our survival curves, combining those together will then give you an optimal kind of rotation for that player. So with that, I just want to say thank you guys all for joining and listening, and thanks to Jamal for inviting me. If you guys have any more questions, you guys feel free to ask them now. I think we got some time, or you can reach out to me on Twitter or by email. And then a lot of these technical details that I kind of skimmed over are available in our paper, both in JQAS, the journal, and in my master's research, which is more easily available through SFU's library. But yeah, thanks for having me, and happy to answer any questions.